While everybody else is getting out of bed, I'm usually getting in it. I'm not in it to win it. And there's 1,000 ways you can skin it.
Sure. Well, actually, there is a distinction to be drawn between a restraining order and a victim's protective order, VPO or PO, as they're commonly known. And typically speaking, the VPO has the higher level of enforceability to it. There's more teeth in it, in effect, and so it's actually harder to get one. The VPO is something that can be actually obtained without an attorney. There are many times when people call and I know they need a VPO, and I certainly just try to walk them through the steps of going to get one. It's done through the court clerk's office and can be obtained, in very short notice. Typically, you need to have some actual evidence that there's been actual physical harm, whether that be medical bills, witnesses that have seen this occur, even scrapes, abrasions, bruising, this type of thing that would be apparent where somebody's been a victim of violence. To some extent, the immediate apprehension of physical harm can be enough, but as we all know, so many times in the periods of heightened emotions that relationships sometimes have to deal with, things are said that don't really constitute a full threat. I'm going to get you, or you're done for, things like this, who knows. That may not be enough to actually get the VPO unless it's accompanied with other indicators that there's certainly a real danger. And the reason for that is because that becomes a permanent part of somebody's actual record. Within this day and age of computers, anybody can type up somebody's name and say, oh, well, my goodness, VPO, and it does have an effect on employment, potentially on future relationships, things such as government clearance, the right to own a handgun, all of these things can be affected by somebody that gets a VPO history against them. So for that reason, it's not taken lightly, and they don't just grant them automatically. Probably, I would suspect, a good number of them are denied, maybe as many are denied as are granted ultimately, because many of the ones that are granted initially as a temporary VPO are ultimately denied at the follow-up hearing when the other party has the right to come in and tell their story. Now, fortunately, a lot of times just when it comes down to that and people understand the seriousness of the situation, the period between the temporary order and the actual hearing is a cooling down period, and hopefully people can go their separate ways or just work through their issues. Sure, I've seen a lot of really bad cases, though, and domestic violence is a real serious problem in this state. It's certainly something that's a statutory disqualifier for custody if it's done in front of children. So people need to be aware of that. Just losing your cool in front of your kids, nobody's saying that's something that should be condoned, but it does happen, and that can actually affect your ability to have custody of your kids in the future. So these domestic violence issues are far-reaching. The restraining order, to finish up on that, most every divorce has an automatic injunctive order that goes into place upon its filing. I say most every, in fact every. And so there are certain less forceful orders, though, that take place in every divorce. Standard orders about just basically not harassing the person and going about the place of employment, things of this nature, that can be reiterated in the court's orders that are somewhat forceful and helpful in the divorce process, but that yet don't rise to the level of these potentially prejudicial records that are created by having an actual VPO against somebody. Safety first, though. I certainly advise many people to err on the side of caution in that area. And unfortunately, I've had 2 or 3 cases that I've been involved with in 17 years now that have resulted in death of one party or the other. 1 by homicide and 2 actually by shootouts with law enforcement. It happens. People are not at their best in these processes, so I always preach caution and safety to my clients. Well, certainly the he said, she said thing is the bane of all judges in divorce court. You see a ton of that, but what you're really looking for is some form of objective evidence or just other evidence that can corroborate that it's actually happened. For example, well, here's the medical record from where I went to the ER that night. Or here's my best friend who I called on the telephone right after it happened, and there's an exception to hearsay rules, or even in this case you could get it into evidence in several ways, but it would be an excited utterance to the other party that this had occurred. Sometimes just the ability to have these things don't happen in an isolated instance. It'd be a pattern of abuse where you would have people that have seen black eyes or seen somebody just wholly distraught, and if where there's been some conversations that could be reported to the court. Contemporaneous reporting is a big part of this. just to suddenly say, I'm an abused spouse, right when you're in the middle of a custody battle, it sometimes seems somewhat self-serving. Whereas if there's been a history of reporting, or even maybe just people that don't have a dog in the fight, you know, co-workers or people from a church or things like this, who could say, yes, historically, over time, that this person's confided in me, that this has happened. So that, you know, contemporaneously telling somebody about it so it doesn't seem like something fabricated after the fact for benefit within the litigation. You bring the officers out and they'll utilize some field discretion as to what needs to be done, but so many times it's just you need to leave, one or the other, and the other one doesn't result in an arrest every time. People are always afraid that their husband's going to be arrested and he's the primary breadwinner for the family, and it's just there's a lot of incentive out there just socially or unfortunately economically that is a disincentive toward actual reporting of these things. And there's whole other issues, obviously, with spousal abuse that center around that. But if it's actually something that needs to be brought forth in court, then it is better to be cognizant of the need to potentially document that each and every time it occurs.